Hello. I'm reading this book right now. It is called The Mushroom at the End of the World on the Possibility of Life in Capitalist Ruins. And it's by Anna Singh. I think that's, sorry if I butchered your name. And it is another life-changing book like the one I was reading before. I can't remember the Staying with the Trouble. Got it. It's basically about this mushroom called Matsutake, which is a Japanese mushroom, but it also grows in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. And she talks about how the mushroom can only grow in the ruins of the forest. Like, it has to grow once everything else has been destroyed, and the pine is the only thing that remains after, and especially flourishes after a fire or after human destruction, like human disturbance. This is a really interesting metaphor of like how to survive in capitalist ruins. The capitalist ruins in this example being the overlogged forests of Oregon. There's a chapter I just got through called Science as Translation, and it talks about how scientists can't decide from different countries how best to kind of cultivate these Matsutake mushrooms that only grow in cooperation with the environment around them. Like, you can only think of Matsutake in relation to the pine that it grows with and the other environmental factors at play. And it's very delicate. It will only grow in disturbance. And so, it specifically grows in Oregon and certain parts of Japan and Yunnan, China, and North Korea. And so there's this conference of like all these scientists who came together to try and talk about the different ways that they understand their science based on their culture. This is a very feminist read of science, right? Like, if you've ever read anything about gender science, you'll know that, who is doing the science is a key factor in how we understand that science. Because there's a lot of cultural bias put into the specific types of tests we do or how we read those results. And so this is true, too, of the Matsutake mushroom. In America, we have a very capitalist approach to it. We want to see it only survive. We only believe that it can survive if it's scalable, economically, like everything else that we make in America. Whereas in Japan, it is less about scalability and more about finding where it is flourishing. So interesting differences, like cultural differences in reading scientific things. And because these people are so far apart in, in the physical world, as well as culturally, and separated by language, there's no way to kind of converge their scientific practices. Like, we just have different scientific understandings of how to best grow Matsutake. And it's also based on the individual forests and like all these other factors. Naturally, my mind went to gaming communities because this is so similar. I've been a part of gaming communities online for, gosh, maybe 20 years, like a long time. At various conventions in the US and various local communities when I was based in Philadelphia and now based in Columbus. And I've participated in other local communities too, like, in Virginia or Massachusetts or Connecticut. And I've seen different practices and cultural things in play. And this happens all the time. There's often a local culture of play. Specifically, like in my scene, in the small press scene, you can see a difference between Eastern play and Western play if you play with people from both sides of the US. And these are things that have kind of organically grown into their culture of play. Like, if they connect with anybody at any conventions, if they play games made by designers in those areas, a certain type of play happens. And certain cultural rules happen too. Different ways are built of like how to address social issues like safety and community, safety rules at the table, and theory of game design and gameplay, like emergent things in play, and the concept of mechanics being tied to story, all those types of things. And just like the Japanese and American scientists with Matsutake, game people, game players, game designers, game communities don't have a way of connecting these theories over time. Like, we have very few recorded resources of these conversations. I feel lucky in that I had the Forge and Story games. Not because they were perfect, but because they were a place where discussions and theories and conversations about culture and social theory and social tools for gamers were recorded over time. Like, you could go to those specific places and just search for different topics, different concepts that you wanted to know about. And that doesn't really exist anymore. We don't have a centralized forum where we go. The newest place I see this happening is on Discord servers. So the Gauntlet community is probably the most similar to these types of communities. I'm not saying that we should necessarily preserve those types of communities in particular. Like, we don't need to do things the same forever. That's bad, obviously. And there are always new and better ways to do things. But I think that when we lose that recorded information, or singular place, oh my God, there are so many noises. When we lose that central place to talk about things, we also lose history and conversations between people that would organically happen. Our history gets lost in translation. And I see conversations happening on Twitter a lot. I know G+ was a big place for a while. It's not as much anymore. And I know game communities online are hard to curate. I've tried to curate them before at Story Games, and I know how difficult it is and how it's a labor of love, and people get burnt out doing it. But what ends up happening is that, like these scientists, we have different practices and they're never translated. And if we could coordinate them, they could potentially be better for the coordination. Like, we would just know more and learn more and have better, more progressive conversations. But instead, what ends up happening is that we have the same conversations over and over again because there's not a reliable resource of history to go back to. And when new people create things that, new safety tools or new community practices, new harassment policies, new communities, there's not an understanding that this has already been done. And then when the people who are older say, this has already been done, look at these resources, the younger people get upset and feel like it's gatekeeping. And it's this endless cycle of just like mixed communication, just things getting, lost in translation. There should always be new ways of doing things. New safety practices might be better than old ones. But I think building upon a history gives us better tools. Looking at what's been done before and improving it or doing something different, I think, is key, instead of repeating the same thing over and over again. You see this in queer communities all the time too, it's just a loss in translation between like an older crowd and a younger crowd, and the younger crowd not having access to a history, and it's not their fault, it's not anyone's fault they don't have access to this history. We're just like marginalized groups that don't have the ability to create or keep that history. And I wouldn't say gaming groups are necessarily marginalized as a whole, but we do lack a concerted history. And I think that's one of the reasons why we can't gain more ground. I know some of you are gonna be like, well, what about that huge, multi-book history of games? I'm sure it's great. It's expensive, right? And people need access to that. I know that there are many academics in gaming, Evan Torner being the one I think of the most because he is my friend and he lives close to me. who talk about kind of preserving a history of gaming so that we can have a more structured culture and history that we can all understand and point to. Yeah, but we don't really have that yet. And that's a bummer. It's those patches and gaps in our communication and in our translation across gaming cultures that things get a little lost. Although it is the strength of individuals in our community to be able to notice those gaps and patches and translate them across communities, translating from east to west, or from local to national, or online to offline. And being able to connect those patches is a strength. It's a strength of science, it's a strength of our communities. So yeah, I guess in a pattern recognition way, look for those gaps and patches and try to make connections.